Hello? Hello? Is it working? Hello? Yeah. Hello, everybody. I invite you to sit down for our next panel. We will start our next segment now. Welcoming Miss Rosanna Costa. Okay, we will start our next segment now. It is great that there is so many to talk about. I know. Well, we will start thanking the previous panel. It was very enlightening. It was great to have Alfredo, Minister Marcel, Minister Pardo, Lucas Aranguena, and James Calloway speaking on green hydrogen. It was very clear on the opportunities for Chile and the challenges ahead. Quizás si lo hacemos en español. I have all the patience in the world. Ok, we will start now. O lo hacemos en español, así todos entienden que se tienen que sentar. O subamos los micrófonos. Increíble, estoy tan contento. Thank you, everybody. No, really, I think it's great that there is so many to talk about, that after every panel, this generates so many connections. That one common topic is, what are you doing the Chile Day? Why so many Chilean people have to go to England to do this? And the answer is this. After any panel, you can see all the connections that you generate, that if you have to ask for a meeting to do this, it might take over a month, over a quarter, to have all these conversations that you just had. So me and the board member of Invest are very happy that these connections happen. So there's no issue. Nonetheless, it was almost like school, like the teacher being here saying, sit down, sit down. So I was trying to avoid that. So very happy that it worked. Now, it is my personal honor to introduce our next distinguished speaker. She is the governor of the central bank, an institution that holds a unique and esteemed position as the safekeeper of Chile's economic stability. And listen to this, the guardian of its investment attractiveness. That's a really good title. The Central Bank of Chile has played a pivotal role in maintaining our nation's financial integrity and fostering an environment that attracts investment and ensures economic resilience. So please, give a warm welcome to Ms. Rosanna Costa.
Thank you for your presentation, and good morning, everybody. I would greet the authorities present this morning. Of course, I have to give thanks to Invest because of all their efforts for gathering us in this wonderful opportunity of Chile Days for many years. This is my second time here in Chile Day in London. The first time was time of regulation agenda. Of course, nowadays is time of monetary policy. So this meeting takes place in a context where progress has been made in rebuilding inflation in many countries. In the case of Chile, annual inflation fell from 14.1% to 5.3% within a year. Although this is still high, the evolution of the macroeconomic scenario suggests that the convergence of inflation to the central bank's 3% target has been consolidating, a process which is expected to be completed during the second half of 2024. This has allowed the board to adjust the degree of monetary tightness, reducing the monetary policy rate by 175 basis points since July to 9.5%. However, as we emphasized in our monetary policy report published last week, although risk has been balancing out, the process of inflationary convergence is ongoing, and we must remain vigilant to deliver price stability to our people. Recent market development and the August CPI print do not change materially the outlook of our monetary policy report. I will take this opportunity to summarize the view of the central bank on the recent evolution and prospect of inflation in Chile and its macroeconomic drivers, the implication for monetary policy, as well as the main risks and challenges ahead. I will also provide a few preliminary reflections on our experience with navigating the inflation cycle over the past few years. Of course, any conclusions are necessarily tentative, as the process of controlling inflation is still underway. Over the past few years, inflation has increased globally due to local and global factors. In the case of Chile, local components have played a very significant role. At its peak, annual CPI inflation reached more than 14 a year ago, way above our 3% target for the 2-year policy horizon. Core inflation, excluding volatile items, also rose to very high level of around 11% during several months. At the central bank, we undertook an aggressive monetary policy tightening, taking the monetary policy rate from 0.5% in July 2021 up to 11.25% in October 2022, and then maintained the rate at that highly restricted level until past July. Over the course of the current year, as tight monetary policy has taken effect, inflation has receded. As the rebalancing of the economy proceeded and convergence of inflation to the target started to firm, the timing was appropriate for starting to ease the policy rate. In August, headline inflation reached, as I have said, 5.3%, and core inflation 7.4% year-on-year, significantly below what we saw a year ago. The decrease has been most pronounced in goods components, including energy, food, and others. Services inflation is also decreasing, but more slowly, especially due to lagged adjustment of regulated tariffs and indexation. The key factor supporting this inflation has been the resolution of macroeconomic imbalances created by massive transfers to households that injected liquidity worth 30% of GDP. This stimulated private consumption in an unprecedented manner, which grew by almost 21% in 2021. Since last year, consumption, particularly in durable goods, has fallen towards sustainable levels. Recent data suggests that the bulk of the adjustment seems to have already occurred. The behavior of consumption has responded to fight inflation conditions in recent quarters, which increased households' financial burden associated with high level of interest rates and inflation. Higher interest rates have also made deposits more attractive, contributing to the recovery of private saving. Along with a significant fiscal consolidation in 2022, the recovery of private saving has helped swing the current account deficit from a peak of 10% of GDP in the third quarter of 2022 to 4.5% in the most recent quarter. Of course, the adjustment of consumption has affected domestic output. Real GDP has contracted for several quarters, mostly due to lower retail activity. However, since much of the adjustment has been concentrated in imported goods, the effect on domestic value added has been much smaller than the fall in consumption. The data for the second quarter shows a year-on-year decline in private consumption of 6.1% in comparison to a fall of 1.1% in GDP, in line with an increase in net exports. The moderation of the business cycle through an adjustment concentrated in imports has so far had a relatively soft effect on the labor market. Annual employment growth has returned to its pre-pandemic average of roughly 2% in recent months. The unemployment rate has fluctuated between 8.5% and 8.8% above last year's figures, at the same time as the recovery of labor force participation has met subdued labor demand. As for wages, these have shown high nominal growth rates influenced by indexation and minimum wage adjustments, but negative real growth rates until recently due to the impact of inflation and declining labor demand in the context of a rebound in labor supply. An additional factor that has contributed to the decline in inflation is the reduction of external cost pressures. Food and fuel prices are lower than last year, following the onset of the war in Ukraine. Other imported good prices have also stabilized, and transportation costs have normalized with the resolution of supply bottlenecks that arose after the pandemic. Another significant determinant of lower inflation pressures has been the behavior of the exchange rate in recent quarters. Compared to its highest level in mid-2022, it appreciated in nominal and effective and real effective terms by around 15%. This reduction occurred in a context where local uncertainty has receded from the peaks of recent years. Other information that can be added to this analysis pertains to the dynamic of price adjustment in companies. Price indices constructed from firm-level electronic payments data show that the frequency of price increases for goods has been decreasing, approaching their historical average. Business surveys conducted by the central bank further highlight the importance of the different determinants of inflation described so far. For several months, companies have been reporting a reduction in price pressures associated with the exchange rate and general cost, while the perceived influence of the level of sales has reached neutral terrain. On the other hand, the surveys also reveal an ongoing pressure of labor costs. Part of this pressure is explained by the impact of inflation on wages through indexation. This will continue to affect price inflation in the coming months, especially of services. In this context, inflation expectation has also fallen significantly. Medium-term expectation from surveys of economic analysts and financial traders and those implicit in asset prices have returned to the 3% target during this year, after showing large deviation over 2021 and 2022. Short-term market expectations have also fallen significantly. Surveys of companies for which we have less history have also started to diminish recently. It is important that the process of consolidating inflation convergence continues to be transmitted to the perceptions and decisions of companies and consumers to reduce the second round effect of high inflation expectation. Inflation expectation above the targets, the impact of local risk and uncertainty in local financial markets, and the excess of liquidity in households introduce additional challenges for our recent inflationary process and for monetary policy. Related to this, inflation forecasts and monetary policy decisions had to rely upon uncertain estimation of consumption propensities. Those estimations were revised upwards several times, given higher than expected household consumption, as we had overestimated the propensity of households to save part of those funds and perhaps also their tendency to react to rising interest rates in this highly unusual situation. Overall, different large shocks, both from the demand and supply side, generated heterogeneous responses of monetary policy across the globe. In our case, the perspective of inflation convergence has allowed to initiate an easing cycle. The red line is Chile. The discussion leads me to make a few preliminary reflections based on the episode of the past few years. Of course, any definite conclusion cannot be drawn in a context where the task of controlling inflation continues to be challenging and is not completed. Also, while a lot of things can be learned from this episode, this will continue to depend on how the situation unfolds. A first important insight is that our monetary policy framework based on flexible inflation forecast targeting has allowed us to navigate the inflation cycle well. This framework entails the commitment by the bank to send monetary policy in a way consistent with bringing the forecasted annual inflation rate to 3% within 2 years, while allowing for transitory inflation deviations. It is important to remember that our monetary policy framework relies upon a floating exchange rate. This contributes to mitigate the impact of shocks affecting the economy and facilitates the adjustment of different markets to those shocks. The monetary policy rate is the instrument to bring inflation to the target based on the evaluation of its drivers for the medium-term inflation outlook. Like elsewhere, our policy framework has severely tested over the past few years due to the significant shocks that strain macroeconomic and financial stability. These shocks increased forecasted inflation, prompting the board to initiate a sharp tightening cycle even before current inflation deviated from target. This response, coupled with fiscal consolidation, rebalanced the macroeconomy. In this sense, when facing unprecedented shocks, waiting for more information may be useful, but the benefits need to be balanced against the cost of delaying action. Mistakes can be made, but a rapid response prevents their effects from lingering and affecting credibility. A second idea is that prudent and predictable behavioral of fiscal policy is a key ingredient in facilitating inflation targeting. The rise in inflation during 2021 and 2022 responded largely to the massive transfers. This leaves as a lesson that fiscal support might be focused and avoid adopting a procyclical stance. In fact, the fiscal consolidation that the authority carried out in 2022 was relevant support for reducing inflation. The significant adjustment in public spending and the rejection of additional pension withdrawal projects were key factors in reducing uncertainty and controlling domestic expenditure pressures. In this way, the fiscal anchor, which was weakened after the strong procyclical behavior in 2021, has been favored by the continuous improvement that have been introduced and the commitment of the authority. A third conclusion is that sound analysis, rich data, and robust models are other key ingredients for the successful implementation of inflation forecasting targeting, especially in unforeseen situations. Analytical tools need to be adapted to such situations to ensure an adequate calibration of the monetary policy response. Regarding data, new information tools can be a big help here. The bank has invested to work with large-scale administrative microdata sets from different sources for the better part of a decade. This information is of higher frequency than standard data and forms the base of real-time estimates of activity, demand, and even inflation. The bank has also been building a closer relationship with companies around the country to learn about their perception of the economy and understand their action. In addition, our staff has been implementing a modeling agenda that is constantly being updated in line with development in the literature and policy needs. For instance, to incorporate heterogeneities among economic agents or macrofinancial linkages. The broader lesson is that applied economic research must be the backbone of monetary policy decision and needs to react swiftly to address changing environments. Fortunately, good data and good researchers are mutually reinforcing. Even more reason to place investing in both among the highest priority for central banks. A final insight is that with inflation becoming a paramount concern to the public, a communication strategy that explains to wider audience the need for tight monetary policy can make them unexpected allies in the fight against inflation. People have suffered the cost of inflation and need to know what is happening, why, and what is needed to reduce inflation, and that the process has costs. Importantly, this perception is actionable. A communication plan that consistently target wider audience has contributed to the notion that monetary policy medicine, back testing as it is, beats inflation. This notion is now shared by mainstream economists and the public at large. But this support may prove short-lived if central banks do not deliver in time lower inflation or their actions are not consistent with their words, damaging the legitimacy of monetary policy. This insight should not be lost and speaks more generally about the role of effective communication and speedy action for maintaining de facto central bank independence, written in the law but not in stone. All institutional arrangements need to eventually make sense to people. I will now move on to summarize the inflation outlook from our September monetary policy report. Overall, both the domestic and external scenario are similar to the previous report from June. In the central scenario, total inflation will continue to decrease, and it is expected to close the year at 4.3 annually, converging to 3% in the second half of 2024. This projection weighs lower than expected figures in previous months against the impact of the recent depreciation of the peso and higher external prices for fuels. Recently, inflation recorded for August surprised downwards in relation to expectations. I would like to point out that high-frequency figures are valuable, especially for what they contribute to trends. However, it is not advisable to draw conclusions from each of them. Extracting the trends from the information we receive and how they relate to the general macroeconomic scenario is what we must consider. Also, other things have happened and will happen before the next monetary policy meeting, including the effects that the depreciation of the peso may have on inflation. Therefore, it is premature to talk about a change with respect to the central scenario. Core inflation will close 2023 at 6.3% annually and reach 3% at the beginning of 2025. The decline in the services component will be slow due to the impact of indexation of wages and prices. In the case of goods, beyond the effect of the peso depreciation, their decline will continue to be determined by more moderate demand pressures and relief from external and internal cost factors. This projection assumes that the output gap will continue to close for the remainder of the year, generating the necessary condition for inflation convergence. That is, the economy will no longer operate above its capacity, which has generated pressure on prices and has contributed significantly to fueling the high inflation levels. The evolution of the local economy, in particular the contraction of private consumption, has led to a decline in the output gap after several quarters in positive territory. Towards 2024 and 2025, the gap will be in negative territory, as in our previous forecast, in line with subdued domestic demand. This will allow completing the inflation convergence process within the policy horizon. The GDP growth projection for this year ranges between -0.5% and 0%. This projection takes into account the impact of operational problems that have affected mining production in recent months, with scheduled production increases for 2023 taking effect as the fourth quarter of this year. Non-mining activity, on the other hand, will resume positive quarterly variation starting at the end of this year, gradually approaching growth rates consistent with its potential level. For 2024 and 2025, as in June report, GDP growth ranges of 1.25% to 2.25%, and 2 to 3% are expected for 2025. Regarding monetary policy, the board began reducing the monetary policy rate in July. In the central scenario, the policy rate will follow the path outlined in the July meeting. This means that by the end of the year, the monetary policy rate will stand between 7.75% and 8%. However, the magnitude and timing of the monetary policy reductions process will depend on the evolution of macroeconomic scenario and its implication for the inflation trajectory. Incoming data has not so far altered this strategy, and the main thrust of the message from the September monetary policy report. The set of projections I have just described is what we call the central scenario. It is based on a set of assumptions about the economic environment, agent behavior, and policy orientation. Based on these assumptions, sensitivity exercises can be carried out, which, while keeping GDP growth within the projected ranges, may require somewhat different monetary policy action. These scenarios constitute the monetary policy corridor around the central scenario. The upper bound of the corridor reflects alternative scenarios in which the inflation convergence process is less favorable than expected. The lower bound of the corridor reflects a scenario in which inflation convergence is faster than anticipated. As for most severe risk scenarios, they are mainly associated with the global macrofinancial context. A further deterioration could trigger episodes of high volatility, reduced liquidity, and incentive for capital outflows from emerging economies. In addition to previously identified sources of risks around the US banking system, there are increasing concerns about China, especially related to the evolution of its economy and financial market. If risk scenarios materialize, their implication for monetary policy will depend on how the combination and magnitude of these elements affect the outlook for medium-term inflation convergence. Finally, some final remarks. Let me wrap up by emphasizing that undoubtedly the reduction in inflation is good news for our people. However, the task is not yet completed, and we remain vigilant. Our central scenario is considering the convergence of inflation to 3% during the second half of 2024. Recent market development, as the August CPI, do not change materially this outlook. The flexible inflation forecast targeting framework has allowed our small and open economy to navigate well during both fair and foul weather since it was implemented in early 2000s. But the task of returning inflation to the 3% goal is not over yet. Although we have made progress in controlling inflation, we are now facing the challenge of completing inflation convergence. Our country has gone through a long and painful cycle for families and businesses affected by the adverse impact of high inflation. The central bank has had to implement a significant adjustment of monetary policy, which has not been without consequences for the economy, but we are already seeing positive results. Going forward, the calibration of monetary policy will require a delicate balance that avoids greater persistence, but also prevents demand weakness that could lead to excessive deflation. To complete the convergence process, our economy will need to grow below its potential for several quarters. This will allow our country to move towards a scenario where growth capabilities can be deployed adequately without the burden of high inflation and the necessary measures to reduce it. Monetary policy will guide the economy towards trend growth while achieving price stability. But the question arises as to whether this growth is satisfactory and how it can be improved. Developing growth capabilities goes beyond what central bank can accomplish. On various occasions, we highlighted the importance of implementing policies that enhance our economy productivity. For example, education remains a critical factor, particularly in terms of regaining what has been lost in recent years. Improving skills of our workers through effective training is also essential. Additionally, the country can and should leverage its natural advantage, positioning itself favorable for the energy transformation that the planet requires, materials of which you were listening in these 2 days. From the central bank, our contribution is precisely to offer stability through low and stable inflation and suitable financial conditions that are favorable for business development, investment, and growth. As I mentioned, this clears the path for the economy to deploy its capabilities. This is by far our most significant contribution to our country. Thank you very much for this moment.
Well, let's give another round of warm applause to Mrs. Rosanna Costa's presentation. Just a logistic issue, there will be no coffee break now because we are running a bit late, so we'll start with the next panel right now in this place. We'll have a very interesting panel. By the way, I'm Hernán Rodríguez, a member of the board of Invest. I forgot that. Today we have a very interesting panel as reflected in its title, Understanding the Power Industry's Conundrum. During the discussion, the speakers will primarily address the present and future of the energy sector in Chile. To do this, we have three very excellent panelists. But before we begin it, and introduce each of the panelists and the moderator, I would like to briefly address the power generation sector in Chile, especially from an historical context, in no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Today, the generation matrix is composed of a very diverse supply. In fact, the installed capacity generation in Chile reaches over 33.5 gigawatts, more than triple the demand on average. The current capacity is made up of 22% hydro, 40% thermal, mainly coal, natural gas, and diesel, 22% solar, and 14% wind. Generation, on the other hand, had a completely different composition in 2022 compared to installed capacity. Has it historically been this way, or have there been significant changes in the supply structure? If we take a look at the last 35 years, we observe significant changes in the industry, starting with the number of participants. In the late 90s, Chile had 4 or 5 significant players in the industry. Today, it is more than 150 companies, from small local developers up to large multinationals, from the 5 continents, deploying all types of technologies from Arica in the north down to Magallanes in the south. Going back to the question about the supply structure, until the late 80s, power generation in Chile was mainly hydro with coal backup. Average demand, on the other hand, reached only 2,000 megawatts in 1990. Today, it is 5 times higher. During 1998, Chile experienced one of the worst droughts in its history, a phenomenon that we have seen practically worsen year after year, with the exception of this year, 2023. Due to the drought and the connection to natural gas from Argentina, several combined cycle power plants based on this fuel started in the late 1990s. However, in 2007, Argentina cut off the gas supply, which combined with the ongoing drought, rising fuel prices, and the 2008 financial crisis had catastrophic effects on the power industry. This led to a very rapid installation of diesel-based generation and the construction of several coal-based power plants. In addition, LNG terminals were built in the north and in the center of Chile in order to supply gas for the combined cycle plants. During this period, especially between 2009 and 2013, the cost of energy in Chile went up to the sky. But from the year 2010 onwards, the boom in renewable energy started to begin. This happened mainly due to the lower development cost of this technology, new bidding terms to supply regulated customers that encourage new players to participate in the sector with relatively cheap options, and the announced decarbonization process. This process, in addition to the commitment made by the country, together the government and the power generation companies, was driven also by the increasing demand from the major free market customers who were demanding more green energy, as we saw yesterday in the mining panel. The strong development of renewable energies, with a lot of generation in the north of the country, has resulted in a major change in the supply structure, with significant challenges, as we will see in the panel discussion. Indeed, some of the challenges we are facing are in regulation, transmission, storage, location, etc. All of this with a huge potential demand due to the eventual development of the green hydrogen industry, as we saw in this morning panel, as well as demand from electric vehicles. These are part of the topics we will address in the following panel. Now, I would like to introduce who are our 3 panelists and the moderator. First, we have the Minister of Energy, Mr. Diego Pardo, who will kick off the panel with a 15-minute presentation. Mr. Pardo is a lawyer from the Universidad of Chile and obtained his master's degree and a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. Before being appointed minister, Mr. Pardo was executive president of the think tank Espacio Público. Alongside the minister, we have 2 experts and long-time figures in the Chilean energy sector. Mr. Bernardo Larraín, who has dedicated a large part of his career to the sector. Today, Bernardo is the vice president of Colbún and chairman of Pivotes, a public policy think tank. He also was the CEO of Colbún between 2005 and 2012. Bernardo was also chairman of the Industrial Association of Chile, SOFOFA, between 2017 and 2021. We also have Mr. Rafael Mateo, CEO of Acciona Energía, a Spanish energy company with presence in more than 40 countries and one of the largest producers of pure renewable energy in Chile. Rafael is an experienced professional in the renewable energy sector and previously held an important role in Endesa Chile between 2005 and 2009 as managing director of Endesa Generación and CEO of Endesa Chile. So he's very familiar with the sector in Chile. The panel will be moderated by Mr. Randolph Brazier, Global Head of Clean Power Systems, WEC Future Energy Leader and Advisory Board Member from HSBC. And following Mr. Pardo's 15-minute presentation, Rafael and Bernardo will make a 5-minute presentation before going into the Q&A. So please give a warm welcome to the 3 panelists and the moderator.
Seating arrangement. How do we sit?
Two in the middle.
We two in the middle?
Yeah.
Okay. You in the middle?
Yeah. Okay. So welcome everyone. I think we're going to start with a presentation from the Minister.
Sure. Well, hello again. Well, I will sit over here. So, I should start saying that where is probably the origin of this conundrum. It's, I would say, twofold. On the one hand, pandemic, and what happened in the chains of supply due to pandemic created two things. On the one hand, increases in prices of fossil fuels, and on the other hand, increases